I never imagined that a single act of cruelty could unravel everything I thought I knew about power, pride, and the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to lose. My name is Anastasia Volkova, and this is the story of how I tried to break a man with a rusty car, only to discover that the car, and the man, held a truth far more valuable than the fortune I was born into. It began on a gray October morning in Moscow, when the first real frost had already settled over the rooftops of our residential complex on the edge of the Presnensky district. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet asphalt, the kind of scent that clings to your coat and follows you indoors. I was 28, the only daughter of a construction magnate whose name still appeared on half the glass towers rising along the Moskva River. My father had died 2 years earlier, leaving me the controlling share of Volkova Holdings and a penthouse that overlooked the entire city like a throne. I had grown used to people bowing slightly when they spoke to me. I had grown used to the soft fear in their eyes. The janitor's name was Dmitry Okonkwo. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with skin the deep brown of polished walnut and hands that looked as if they had never known rest. He was the only black man in our building, and one of the few I had ever spoken to in my entire life. People whispered that he had come from somewhere in West Africa years ago, married a Russian woman who later died, and stayed for the sake of their little girl. He cleaned the floors, emptied the trash chutes, fixed leaky pipes in the basements, and never complained. His daughter, 6-year-old Sophia, sometimes waited for him in the lobby after school, her small backpack almost as large as she was. She had her father's quiet eyes and her mother's pale Russian features. The other residents smiled at her and looked past him. I noticed him properly for the first time on the day my father's old driver, Ivan, retired. Dmitry had been assigned to carry the heavy boxes of personal files from the underground parking to the service elevator. I watched from the glass balcony as he worked. Sweat darkened the collar of his gray uniform. When he paused to wipe his forehead, our eyes met for a second. He nodded once, politely, then returned to the boxes. Something in that simple nod irritated me more than any open challenge could have. That evening I found a reason to speak to him. I claimed one of the hallway lights on the 7th floor was flickering. He came with a stepladder and a toolbox. While he worked, Sophia sat on the bottom step of the stairwell, coloring in a small notebook. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, arms folded, watching. "You're the new janitor," I said, though he had already been there for 8 months. "Yes, Anastasia Sergeyevna," he answered without looking at me. His Russian was careful, slightly accented, but clear. My father used to say a man who works with his hands should keep them clean. I let the words hang. "Yours look permanently stained." He finished tightening the fixture, climbed down, and closed the toolbox. "The work is honest," he said quietly. Then he took Sophia's hand and walked away. I told myself I hated the calm in his voice. I told myself he thought he was better than the rest of us because he refused to flinch. The truth was simpler and uglier. I had never been refused anything by a man who had less than I did. Dmitry's quiet refusal to be diminished felt like a personal insult. Winter arrived early that year. Snow piled against the building's outer walls, and the heating system groaned under the strain. One afternoon I returned from a board meeting to find Sophia crying in the lobby. Her father was nowhere in sight. She had fallen on the ice outside the school and scraped her knee. The security guard had brought her inside, but no one else had stopped. I crouched beside her, more out of habit than kindness, and asked where her father was. "He's fixing the boiler in the basement," she whispered. He said not to bother anyone. I took her upstairs to my apartment, cleaned the scrape, and gave her hot tea with sugar. When Dmitri finally appeared, still in his wet work clothes, his face was tight with worry and apology. He thanked me in a low voice and tried to pay for the bandages with the few crumpled notes in his pocket. I refused the money and watched him leave with his daughter pressed against his side. That night I sat alone in the dark living room, staring at the city lights, and felt something shift inside me. It was not compassion. It was the sudden, sharp need to remind him of his place. If kindness from me unsettled him, then deliberate humiliation would settle the score. The idea came the following week when the building's management announced a clearance of old vehicles from the underground storage units. One of them belonged to my late father, an ancient, rust-eaten Volga GAZ-24 that had sat unused for more than a decade. The body was the color of dried blood where the paint still clung. The windows were cloudy with age. The engine had not turned over in years. Everyone assumed it was worthless scrap. My father's personal papers had mentioned it only once, in a faded note about the old project car, but I had never bothered to look further. I arranged for the car to be towed into the open courtyard on a Saturday morning when most residents were home. Then I summoned Dmitri. He arrived in his weekend clothes, a thin coat, worn boots, and a knitted hat pulled low against the cold. Sophia stood a few steps behind him, holding a plastic bag of groceries. I stood beside the Volga with my lawyer and two of the building's security men, making sure there would be witnesses. "Dmitri," I said, loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear, "management has decided the storage fees for this wreck are no longer justified. Rather than pay for its disposal, I am giving it to you. Consider it a gift for your dedicated service." Laughter rippled through the small crowd. Someone muttered that even the scrap yards might refuse it. Dmitri looked at the car, then at me. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes went very still. "I cannot accept this," he said. "You can and you will," I answered. "The papers are already signed in your name. If you leave it here, the fine for abandonment will come out of your wages. Take it. Drive it. Sell it for scrap. Whatever you prefer." Sophia tugged at his sleeve. "Papa, it's free. Maybe we can fix it." He placed a hand on her shoulder without looking away from me. For a long moment I thought he would refuse again. Instead he simply nodded once, took the keys from my outstretched hand, and walked to the driver's side. The door creaked open like an old wound. He sat inside, turned the key, and to everyone's surprise the engine coughed, sputtered, and then caught with a rough, uneven roar. Smoke poured from the exhaust. He drove the Volga slowly out of the courtyard while the neighbors clapped and laughed. Sophia climbed into the passenger seat, waving at no one in particular. I stood there feeling the sharp satisfaction of victory. I had given a man who had nothing a symbol of how little he was worth. The story would spread through the building by evening. People would remember that Anastasia Volkova did not tolerate quiet dignity from those beneath her. 3 days later the first crack appeared in my certainty. Dmitri did not sell the car for scrap. He parked it behind the service entrance and began working on it in the evenings after his shifts. I watched from my balcony as he replaced the battery, cleaned the carburetor, and sanded rust from the fenders with patient, methodical movements. Sophia sat nearby on an overturned crate, handing him tools and talking to him in the soft, serious way children speak when they believe they are helping. Sometimes other residents stopped to mock him. He never answered them. He simply continued. A week after that, an elderly mechanic from the neighboring block, Sergei, who had once worked in a state garage during Soviet times, came to look at the car. I saw them talking for nearly an hour. Sergei kept shaking his head and gesturing at the engine bay. When he left, Dmitry stood alone for a long time with one hand resting on the roof of the Volga, staring at nothing. I told myself it was nothing. A poor man clinging to a worthless gift out of pride. I even sent one of the security guards to offer him 5,000 rubles for the scrap value, just to end the spectacle. Dmitry refused the money without raising his voice. Then the letter arrived. It came by registered post, addressed to Dmitry Alkonquo, care of the building management. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and bore the seal of a private auction house in Geneva. I intercepted it only because the manager brought it to me first, uncertain what to do. I opened it in my study with the same cold curiosity I had once reserved for my father's business contracts. Inside was a formal appraisal, written in careful English and translated into Russian. The Volga GAZ-24 was not an ordinary production model. According to the documents my father had quietly preserved, it was one of only 3 surviving prototypes fitted with a rare experimental engine and custom interior commissioned in the late 1970s for a high-ranking Soviet official who never took delivery. The chassis number matched records held by a Swiss collector's archive. Estimated market value at current European auction rates, between 7 and 8 million United States dollars. I read the letter 3 times. My hands did not shake, but something inside my chest did. I had given a man a fortune as an insult. For 2 full days I did nothing. I walked through my penthouse like a stranger, touching the cold marble counters and the leather furniture that no longer felt like mine. At night I stood on the balcony and watched the distant shape of the Volga under the security lights. Dmitry continued to work on it in the evenings, unaware. Sophia still brought him sandwiches wrapped in newspaper. On the 3rd morning I went down to the service entrance myself. The air was sharp with frost. Dmitry was under the open hood, sleeves rolled up despite the cold. When he saw me he straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Anastasia Sergeyevna," he said. "Nothing more." I held out the letter. "You should read this." He took it, scanned the first page, then the second. His face remained almost expressionless, but I saw the moment the numbers registered. He lowered the paper and looked at me for a long time. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because I did not know," I said. The words tasted like ash. I thought it was scrap. "I wanted to humiliate you. That is the truth." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat. "Then you succeeded for a while." "I am offering to buy it back," I said. "At full value. You can have the money today. Your daughter will never want for anything again." He shook his head once. "No. You cannot be serious. $8 million. It is not about the money," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "You gave me this car to make me small. If I sell it back to you, I stay small. If I keep it, or if I sell it myself, then the choice is mine. That is the only thing that matters now." Sophia appeared from around the corner carrying 2 cups of tea in plastic mugs. She offered one to her father and one to me without hesitation. I took it because refusing felt impossible. The tea was too sweet and slightly bitter, the way children make it when they want to be helpful. That evening I could not sleep. I kept seeing the way Dmitry had looked at the letter, not with greed, but with a kind of weary recognition, as if the universe had finally decided to speak to him in a language he understood. I thought of my own father, who had left me towers of glass and contracts thick with power, yet had never once looked at me the way Dmitry looked at Sophia when she handed him a tool. Over the following weeks the story changed. Word of the car's true value spread through the building, then through the district. Journalists from minor online papers began appearing. Dmitry refused every interview. He continued his work as janitor. He continued repairing the Volga in the evenings, now with greater care, as if preparing it for a journey he had not yet decided to take. Sergei the old mechanic returned with friends. They spoke of restoration, of shipping the car to Europe, of the kind of buyers who paid in silence and cash. I found myself inventing reasons to be near the service entrance. Sometimes I brought Sophia a book or a small puzzle. Sometimes I simply stood and watched Dmitry work. We spoke little at first. When we did, the conversations were careful, almost formal. He told me about the village near Lagos where he had grown up, about the engineering studies he had begun and never finished, about the Russian nurse who had married him and died of pneumonia 3 winters earlier. I told him about the emptiness of boardrooms, about the way my father's approval had always felt like a transaction, about the nights I walked through rooms full of expensive furniture and felt nothing at all. One evening in late November the first heavy snow of the season fell. Dmitry was finishing the last of the bodywork under a makeshift tarp. Sophia had fallen asleep in the back seat of the Volga, wrapped in an old blanket. I brought thermos flasks of coffee and stood beside him while the snow gathered on our shoulders. "Why did you stay in Russia after your wife died?" I asked. He tightened the final bolt, then closed the hood with quiet finality. "Sophia is Russian. This is her home. A father does not take a child away from the only soil she knows simply because the soil is hard." I looked at the sleeping girl and felt something in my chest crack open. "I was cruel to you." "Yes," he said. "You were. I am sorry." He turned to face me fully. Snowflakes caught in the short curls of his hair. "Apology is a beginning, Anastasia. Not an ending." That night I returned to the penthouse and opened the safe where my father's private papers were kept. Among them I found a second set of documents concerning the Volga, photographs from the 1970s, handwritten notes about the experimental engine, and a letter from a Swiss intermediary offering to store the car indefinitely should political winds change. My father had known exactly what the vehicle was. He had kept it hidden not out of forgetfulness, but out of some private calculation I would never fully understand. In giving the car away as an insult, I had unknowingly completed a circle he had started decades earlier. December arrived with its long darkness and the smell of pine from the Christmas markets. Dmitry finished the restoration. The Volga no longer looked like a wreck. The body gleamed with fresh dark red paint. The interior had been carefully cleaned and repaired. When he started the engine now, it ran with a deep, steady voice that made people stop and listen. On a clear afternoon he invited me to sit in the passenger seat. Sophia climbed into the back, excited. We drove slowly through the side streets of the district, past the gray apartment blocks and the small parks where children played in the snow. For the first time in years I felt no need to perform strength. The city moved past the windows like a memory I was finally allowed to observe without owning. At a red light Dmitry spoke without looking at me. "I have decided. I will sell the car. Not to you. To a collector in Switzerland who has already made an offer. The money will go into a trust for Sophia. Education. Safety. A future that does not depend on anyone's pity. I nodded. My throat felt tight. And you? I will keep working, he said. For a while longer. Then perhaps something else. I have ideas. We returned to the building as the sun began to set behind the towers. Sophia ran ahead to show a neighbor the shiny car. Dimitri and I stood beside it in the quiet courtyard. I tried to make you small, I said. Instead I discovered how small I had become. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face with a gentleness that undid every defense I had left. You are not small, Anastasia. You are only learning how to stand without the armor. That evening I walked alone along the embankment of the Moskva River. The water moved dark and slow under the bridges. I thought of every cold word I had spoken, every calculated slight, every moment I had chosen power over decency. The rusty car had been meant as a weapon. Instead it had become a mirror. In the months that followed, the sale was completed with quiet efficiency. The Volga left Russia on a climate-controlled transport. The money arrived in a Swiss account under Sophia's name, protected by layers of legal safeguards. Dimitri continued as janitor for another half-year, then accepted a position with a small engineering firm that valued practical skill over pedigree. Sophia grew taller, brighter, and began calling me Aunt Nastia without any prompting from either of us. I sold the controlling share of the family company to a consortium that promised better wages for the lower staff and transparent contracts. The penthouse felt too large after that, so I moved to a smaller apartment closer to the river. Sometimes in the evenings Dimitri and Sophia came for dinner. We cooked simple meals, buckwheat, roasted vegetables, tea strong enough to wake the dead. We spoke of ordinary things, Sophia's school projects, the changing weather, the quiet satisfaction of work done well. One night in early spring, after Sophia had fallen asleep on the couch, Dimitri and I stood on the small balcony of my new place. The city lights reflected on the water. He took my hand without ceremony. I never hated you, he said. Even when you tried to make me hate myself. I turned toward him. I hated the version of myself that needed to hurt you. He smiled then, the first full smile I had ever seen on his face. It transformed him completely. Then we both survived the car. I leaned my head against his shoulder. The night air was cold, but the warmth between us was steady and real. Somewhere in Geneva a rare Soviet prototype sat in a private collection, its value measured in millions. Here in Moscow, on a quiet balcony above the river, its true worth had already been spent, on dignity restored, on a child's future secured, and on the slow, difficult birth of something that might one day be called love. I used to believe that power was the ability to diminish others. I know now that real power is the courage to stand corrected, to offer an open hand instead of a closed fist, and to accept that the most valuable things in life often arrive disguised as rust and humiliation. The black single father who cleaned our floors taught me that lesson without ever raising his voice. And the rusty car I gave him to break his spirit became the instrument that finally set us both free.